You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Growing up in church, I often heard people say how they wish they could live back in Bible times. It would be so much easier if we lived in a time when God just spoke to people whenever. If I had a question, I could go to Moses about it, or I could be one of Jesus' disciples. But the more we look at these stories, we find that those times weren't actually that different from how life is today. It often seems like so much more supernatural stuff is going on in the Bible than today, but that's really only because we're focusing on specific stories of supernatural events in the Bible. These stories weren't everyday occurrences for people back then any more than they are for people today. It would be like watching Star Wars and thinking that every day the average person encountered Jedi or stormtroopers or went on an adventure across the galaxy. No, those are just the stories that have been told because they're the most interesting ones. And it's the same way with the Bible. I'm excited for our material today because I think it's really humanizing. We get to see from Moses' perspective and his family's perspective, particularly his mother, and we're going to get to see through their eyes the very humanness of their story. It's so easy to put these people on a pedestal back then as if they were way better believers than we are, or just people with more faith than we have today. But that's not really the case. And so this chapter gives us an opportunity to see through the very human eyes of some very familiar characters. I'm really excited for this discussion, and we have a lot to cover today. So let's get right into Exodus chapter 2. Let's get started reading the first few verses of this chapter. There went out a man from the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes, and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child in it, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. And his sister stood afar off, to wit what would be done to him. All right, let's pause there for now. So that's just the first 4 verses. I am probably going to end up saying this several times this episode, but do your best as we talk through this to pretend like you have never heard this story before. I can't help but imagine that many of you listening are quite familiar with Moses' story. He is one of the more popular characters in the Bible. In fact, he is one of the most important and prominent figures in the entirety of the Tanakh and the Jewish faith. So it's really easy when we come to this story to import in everything we know and all the things that we think we know about the story. So as best as possible, just try right now to take a second, put all of that aside in some corner of your mind, and we're just going to pretend like we have never read this before. So starting with verse 1, we'll note that we're not actually given the names of Moses' parents here. Their names don't even appear for another 4 chapters. They show up in Exodus 6:20 for the first time. And we are told there that his father's name was Amram and his mother's name Jochebed. They don't really show up much in the story, particularly not Amram, his father. But one particularly, how shall I say, uncomfortable fact about them that you probably won't hear preached in church is that Exodus 6:20 also says that Amram married his own aunt. So Jochebed is not just his wife, but his aunt. We got a little bit of an Alabama thing going on here. It becomes even more awkward when Moses then records a law in Leviticus 18:12 that you're not supposed to marry your own aunt. So I can only imagine how those Thanksgiving dinner conversations must have gone after that happened. Now, if you're familiar at all with the story of the Exodus and the children of Israel wandering around in the wilderness and all that, you're probably familiar with Aaron the Levite. We often speak of him as a Levite. But we tend to forget that that means Moses was a Levite too. They were brothers, so they came from the same family line. And with the benefit of hindsight, we think of the Levites as the priestly tribe in Old Testament Israel. But God didn't pick the Levites out as the priests until Exodus 28. So, again, let's be careful not to read the future of the biblical text into the passage that we're in now. We just want to focus on where we're at and let things come chronologically. So leave off the idea of the Levites as priests for now, and let's just consider what we know about this particular tribe. At this point in the biblical narrative, all we know about Levi is what we have in Genesis 34, when Levi, the actual ancestor of the tribe, one of Jacob's 12 sons, along with his brother Simeon, killed an entire city's worth of men after the prince of that city raped their sister. And in Genesis 49, when their father Jacob is speaking prophetically about each son and what their descendants will be like, he describes Levi this way. This is Genesis 49, verses 5 and following. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are their habitations. O my soul, come not into their secret, unto their assembly. My honor, don't be united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they dig down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob, and scatter them in Israel. Hold on to that idea of slaying a man in anger. That's going to come up later in this chapter. But these verses are not exactly the picture that we usually have of the priestly tribe, are they? Well, Jacob's prophecies actually came true, as they turned out to be one of the most violent tribes in ancient Israel. In fact, they're not even given a portion of the promised land when they get there under Joshua, bringing to fulfillment what Jacob had said all those years before, that they would be divided amongst the tribes. So if we imagine that we had never read this story before and we don't know who any of these characters are, I think we'd actually be a little wary of what's going on here, wondering if this descendant of Levi will carry on his violent legacy or start a new one. And if you're familiar with the Moses story, you might already realize that he kind of takes a road in between the two. He has times when he lashes out violently, much like his ancestor Levi. And in fact, the first recorded action that we have of Moses, we'll get to this a little bit later today, is his committing manslaughter. But the next 40 years of his life seem to mellow him out to the point that he becomes a little more meek and patient. So it's a step in the right direction, but we're going to find that Moses is still not quite the redeemer that Israel has been looking for to restore Eden. Robert Alter, in his translation and commentary, draws attention to the frequent use of the word take in this chapter. There are certain English versions that might say something along the lines in verse 1 of this man from the house of Levi married a daughter of Levi. But if you look more closely, if you're using a version that has italics like the King James, you're going to see that to wife is italicized. It's not there in the original text. It literally just reads, there went a man from the house of Levi and took a daughter of Levi. That can and arguably even should sound a bit offensive to our modern ears. But that is often the language the Bible uses of a man marrying a woman. It was a very patriarchal culture, so it was kind of like acquiring land. He just takes a woman. And in fact, if you have an English translation that says wife at any point, like even here in the King James, that is technically a translation. There is no Hebrew word separate for wife. There's just the words for man and woman, and in certain contexts they get translated as husband and wife, but it's actually the same word in Hebrew. So it's really easy to import in our modern ideas of marriage into the way that marriage worked back then, but it's really not the same entity. It's just a man taking a woman. There wasn't this full ceremony and everything like we have today. It was honestly just more of a business transaction in a way. And again, that is just the way that the biblical authors talked about marriage, so that is not in and of itself a red flag about Amram. However, anytime we see taking language in the Bible, particularly in the Torah, in the first 5 books, we should be a little on edge about what's going on, because this goes all the way back to the garden when the woman first saw and took from the tree. So that happens again in Genesis 6, where the sons of God see and take the daughters of humanity. So I wouldn't go so far as to say Amram is being painted in a negative light here, but I do think it's something where if we're going to be attentive readers, we're going to have a little bit of a guard up, wondering if this is going to go well or not. Now, if you've listened to either of our Genesis series, you might remember that Genesis is broken up by these sections that start with genealogies, or potentially end with genealogies, depending on which way you're reading it. But they often introduce a new character coming in. So This doesn't happen here. We're not given a backstory on Moses. We're not told anything about his siblings or his family other than just that his parents were from the tribe of Levi. So we're almost made to think that Moses is the firstborn here until a little bit later when we learn that he has an older sister. And then, actually, several chapters later when we learn he has an older brother. So even though we don't realize it at first, this story is a continuation of the theme from Genesis of God's choosing the younger over the older. We saw that with Cain and Abel, possibly with Shem, even though we don't actually know for sure the birth order of Noah's sons. And then we didn't go beyond those stories in our series, but it happens again with Isaac and Ishmael. It happens again with Jacob and Esau. It happens again with Jacob's sons. So we should not be surprised when we see God flaunting cultural norms of the day and choosing the younger over an older sibling to lead his people. I've already drawn attention to the importance of noticing italicized words in versions that do that. And we have that happening here again in verse 2. Because if we look in the middle of the verse, when it says that Moses' mother saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. That's kind of weird wording, and you might notice that was and child are missing. So it's literally when he saw him good. Or Hebrew often does not need to express state of being verbs like is, are, am, were, that kind of thing. It can just kind of be assumed in the sentence. So it's basically saying when she saw that he was good. I don't know about you, but I have heard more than one preacher in my lifetime look at this verse and its strange wording and deduce from that Moses was a particularly cute or handsome baby. In fact, most English translations say he was a beautiful child. Some say fine. The New Living Translation actually goes so far as to say special baby. When she saw that he was a special baby, she hid him for 3 months. So before we go any further, I would love to hear from you all. Drop a comment in our social media or on YouTube. Let me know, have you heard a preacher try to say that Moses was a good-looking child or a particularly cute baby or something along those lines because of this verse? How have you heard this preached, if at all? Because believe it or not, this isn't even just an English thing. There are all sorts of wild and wacky traditions surrounding Moses' birth that you've probably never heard of in church. I mean, even going back to Josephus, he said, get this, you're not going to believe this, right? Josephus said that there were magi that visited Moses at his birth. And Josephus was writing at the same time the Gospels were being written. So as far as we know, he did not have access to Matthew's Gospel account that mentions these magi going to see baby Jesus. I realize this is not a Christmas episode, but there were other traditions in the ancient Near East, including in Roman mythology, of magi or astrologers from a distant land coming to see an important baby at their birth. So we don't have time to go into all of that right now, but I will link to some articles in the show notes that go into some of those traditions about Moses' birth that they'll just amaze you. I highly recommend checking them out. But as cool as those are, that's not actually what the verse is talking about. The verse does not say that they saved him because he looked good or that they thought he was going to have some big purpose to his life. No, it just says that he was good. The Bible never claims that Moses' parents had some foreknowledge of what he would become or do. Now, the book of Hebrews says that they have faith, but it doesn't really specify in which way or about what. So there's nothing here to suggest that they understood that he was going to do something great with his life or that they thought he was a really beautiful child. Like, that's not the point. The verse just says that she saw he was good. Any of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while should have some alarm bells going off in your head, triggering back to Genesis chapter 1, and they saw that it was good. Sounds like what God said 7 times in the creation week, right? So this is like a new creation for Israel as the creator of this child, his mother, sees that he is good. Oh, I know I said I was going to leave the rest of the traditions about Moses' birth for the show notes, but I have to mention this. There's a particularly common Jewish tradition that when Moses was born, the whole house was filled with light. It just completely radiated from him. Doesn't that sound like creation language as well? Let there be light, and it was good. Like, as soon as his baby is born, the whole house is filled with light, and they saw that he was good. Oh, come on. I realize that's tradition, not Bible there, but, oh, it just ties together so well. I love it. Moving into verse 3, we get yet more Genesis connections. The word for ark used here, it's the Hebrew word teva. It appears in the Tanakh, in the entirety of the Old Testament, just here and in the flood story. So this is the same word used of Noah's ark, and it's used nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. When that happens, it's almost guaranteed that the biblical authors are trying to get us to connect those two stories together, to compare and contrast, and read this one in light of the previous one. Now, in case there are any super nerds out there who are thinking way ahead, this is not the same word as the Ark of the Covenant used later. That is actually a different word, even though we got the English word ark in all three stories for Noah's Ark, Moses' Ark as a baby, and then the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is a different word in Hebrew. So if you were thinking that, major gold star. If not, don't worry about it. That's quite the nerdy rabbit trail. I think I mentioned back when we were doing our Genesis 7 through 11 series and talking about Noah's Ark and the flood and all that, that the word teva is likely an Egyptian loanword in the first place. And if that's the case, it probably signified a chest or coffin originally, like something you put a dead body in. And if we're just looking at this story, I realize I didn't read verse 6 yet, but verse 6 says that Pharaoh's daughter opened the ark. So there's somewhat of a covering on this ark. It's not just the normal basket that you see depicted in children's stories or cartoon versions of this. Like, the ark enclosed baby Moses. I'm going to take a second here and read a quote from Michael Morales' book, Exodus Old and New. Now, if you're interested in studying Exodus and understanding it from a big picture perspective, I highly recommend this book, Exodus Old and New by Michael Morales. Okay, you ready for this? This is going to completely change your understanding of what happened when Moses' mother put him in the river. This blew my mind when I first read it. Among the treasures of the Cairo Museum, there is an elongated reed basket containing the body of a child from around 10,000 BC, perhaps reflecting funerary practices in Egypt, so that some have surmised the Levite mother may have put on a funeral ruse. Whether or not this is so, James Gray's understanding of the story's symbolism remains. The Savior of Israel was laid in a coffin and taken from a watery grave. As with the flood story, however, the ark is actually a means of salvation from the waters of death. The ark functions more like a womb than a tomb. In the first half of the deluge narrative, that's the flood, the waters represent death and destruction, prevailing over the earth so that all flesh dies, only to give way to the idea of life and new creation in the second half, beginning with God's sending of a wind, ruach, over the waters so that the dry land appears. Similarly, the imagery in Moses' rebirth story transitions from death to life when the daughter of Pharaoh descends into the river to cleanse herself. Her maidens, like attendant midwives, bring the ark to her, and when she opens it, she sees the child. In this beautifully crafted account, the word for child in Exodus 2:6 is the exact center of the story with 70 words on either side. End quote. Do you get it? There's a theory, and we can't know this for 100% sure, but it really makes sense to me, that this ark that Moses' mother made, this basket, was actually a coffin. And it seems like there may have been an Egyptian practice at that time of putting the body of a deceased child in a basket with a cover on top and then floating it down the river. If that's the case, that really amplifies the imagery of life from death here in this story. It's wild. Alter takes a second to draw attention to the use of water in this story. He says it's clear from the story that water plays a decisive thematic role in Moses' career. He is born safely on the water, which Pharaoh had imagined would be the very means to destroy all the Hebrew male children. He floats among the reeds, foreshadowing the miraculous triumph over the Egyptians that will lead to the parting of the Sea of Reeds. His obtaining water for the thirsting people will figure prominently in the wilderness stories. So if you've seen any of our social media posts for this series, you may have noticed that the background image is of water. And we did that because it features so prominently in Moses' story. We have a few words in this verse that aren't necessarily common English words we use in everyday communications. So if you're a little confused about what exactly the ark is made of here, the word bulrush is there. That would be papyrus reeds. Slime is bitumen, which was a thick sealing residue, kind of like an oil. Pitch is very similar to bitumen. It's almost actually a synonym as far as we can tell. They're both pretty rare words in the Bible. The idea seems to be that Moses' mother was waterproofing the ark. And the flags that are mentioned there are reeds as well. So, like Alter said, there's a bit of foreshadowing with the reeds here for when Israel leaves Egypt. If you remember back in our first episode for the series, The Stuff You Don't Know, I mentioned that Moses' life in many ways foreshadows what is going to happen in Israel's journey. So, this is definitely a case of that here. Now, I just want to pause for a second before we get any further and encourage you to put yourself in the place of Moses' mother here. What do you think this would have felt like for her? Imagine being in a situation where you felt that your child had a better chance at survival if you put them in a coffin and floated them down the river than if you kept them in your own house. And what was she hoping would happen here? There are so many things that could have gone wrong. It could have capsized. A wild animal could have got it. Even if another human found him while he was still alive, there's no guarantee they would have wanted to rescue the baby. Abandoning an infant to the elements was actually kind of a relatively common way to get rid of an unwanted baby in certain ancient cultures. But there is nothing in the text to indicate that Moses' parents didn't want him. In fact, it seems to be the opposite. So how must that have made her feel? And what good was she hoping could come out of this? The absolute emotional roller coaster that Moses' mother Jochebed must have felt throughout the events of this chapter is just mind-blowing to me. And we're not given an insight into any of that. But I believe that if we are going to be faithful and thoughtful readers of this text, we have to take the time to sit with Jochebed in the pain of her story. Verse 4 is the first time that we learn Moses has any siblings, and we don't find out his sister's name until later in the book, but Miriam will come back into the spotlight at key moments of Moses' story. I'm just so intrigued by her role in this chapter. I seem to remember learning as a child, and I could be totally misremembering this here, but this is the memory I have, of being taught that Moses' mother, Jochebed, told Miriam to go watch her brother, like to see what would happen to him. But the text doesn't say that. Once Jochebed puts the baby in the water, she leaves. It just says that his sister stood afar off to wit, to know, to find out what would happen to him. There's nothing that suggests Jochebed told her to do that. Now, it's possible, but it's also possible she just went of her own accord. I kind of wonder if Jochebed even realized Miriam had stayed there. And she had to have been grieving through this and could have easily just gone off to go back home and not realize that Miriam had slipped out in the meantime. Depending on how old Miriam was at this time, that could possibly change her rationale for being there, but the Bible doesn't actually ever tell us how much older Miriam was than Moses. Later tradition suggests about 7 years older, but we don't know that for sure. So, I don't have a better guess than that, so if we're just going off of tradition, we have this roughly 7-year-old girl who is now watching her 3-month-old brother float down the river. So let's find out what happens to him. Verse 5. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the riverside. When she saw the ark among the flags, the reeds, she sent her maids to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him, and said, This is one of the Hebrews' children. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go and call to you a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she could nurse this child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I'll give you wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses. And she said, Because I drew him out of the water. Man, what an incredible story, right? Well, there's some really cool details that often get missed in these few verses, so let's dig a little bit deeper now. Like I said last week, we don't know for sure who the Pharaoh was at this time. So that means we also can't know for sure who his daughter was, or even how old she would have been at the time that she found the child. We're not even 100% sure what she was doing bathing in the river. Verse 5 just says that she went to wash at the river. And the reason it's a little ambiguous what exactly that means is the Egyptians actually had indoor plumbing. They would not have had to go to the river to bathe, at least not the royal family. So some scholars have suggested that maybe she was bathing as part of a purification ritual. Others have suggested even a fertility ritual, possibly, since the Nile was seen as a source of life. Either one of those could definitely help to explain why she was so quick to accept the child that she found. Perhaps she would have seen it as a sign from the gods, but we just can't know for sure exactly why she was there. And it seems unlikely that she was just going there to bathe herself to get clean, so we can't quite know for sure the reasoning. And though we don't know her name, later Jewish traditions supply her a name. And this is incredible because it is a name that no other person in the biblical story or Jewish tradition was ever given. That's Bat Yah. Bat Yah. It means daughter of Yah, daughter of God. Again, it's tradition. It's not necessarily exactly how the story went, but I think that is so beautiful that just as she adopted this child into her family, so God would have adopted her into his. Oh, I love it. Now, I grew up in church and I read the Bible quite a bit. So whenever I see the word behold show up in a biblical text, I just kind of don't even register it. It just feels like old King James wording to me. But behold is a signal to us as the readers to stop and pay attention to something that's going on. So if you ever see that word behold show up in the biblical text, that means shake yourself awake real fast and pay attention to what's going to happen. And in this particular instance, Morales challenges us to see it as an invitation to look through the eyes of Pharaoh's daughter. That just as she now sees this baby, behold, look, we see the baby as well. And what is he doing? He's crying. Morales points out that this, quote, is the first activity ascribed to the infant. Previously, the babe was merely a passive object. On his rebirth, however, it's as if he only now is truly born. He cries. A wet nurse is called for. He grows, and finally he is given a name by the young woman, the daughter of Pharaoh, who in drawing him out of the waters of the Nile had given him a kind of rebirth. On his deliverance through the waters, Moses is transferred out of the household of Hebrew slaves under Pharaoh's threat and enters the Pharaoh's Egyptian household as a royal son. Indeed, the narrative resolves with a stunning statement, he became her son. End quote. That's so cool. This is what I love about the Bible. The way the authors just wove in these little details that make the story really just fly off the page. But we so often lose it when we read it because they're so familiar to us. And we're so used to the Americanized preaching of these stories that we're just looking to get our little 3 points in a poem outline out of this that we miss the beauty of the story itself. This is an incredibly well-crafted story. And we are going to run into so many more examples of that kind of skilled writing, even just in this chapter. Alter points out that there are two different words used for baby Moses in verse 6. There's the normal child word at the start of the verse, and then just after that, the one that the King James translates as babe. And that's actually the word na'ar in Hebrew. And it's often used for an older child or even a young man, like a teenager, basically, or someone in their early 20s, perhaps. So it's a little odd for the biblical authors to use that particular word to describe a 3-month-old. And Nahum Sarna, who is a very prominent Old Testament scholar as well, claimed that this was the only time in the Tanakh that the word for crying was used of a baby rather than an adult. No one is 100% sure why those words were chosen to describe the baby Moses here, but it does seem to be at least to set him apart as something special, at least in the minds of the later biblical writers. And did you notice how those writers described Pharaoh's daughter as having compassion? That sets her in stark contrast to her father, who exhibited none. In fact, she is actually the first person in the entire biblical narrative this far to have compassion as a highlighted character quality. Growing up, I was taught a very insular Christianity, the kind where we are the only right ones and everyone else out there is wrong. Like, we are the virtuous ones, we are the good ones, and there are just all those sinners out there. And I was taught that the Jewish view was very similar, that they saw themselves as the chosen people and to hell with everyone else. But the more I've studied the biblical text, and in particular the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the more I've realized that is not the least bit the case. This is a pagan. This is the enemy. Like, literally, the daughter of the person who has just ordered a bunch of Hebrew babies to be killed And she's the first person in the biblical text to be labeled as compassionate. The Bible is not an us versus them document, and if you ever hear someone using it in that way, they are misusing it. The goal is not to make everyone else like us, to convert everyone else to be like us. No, by presenting this pagan daughter of a murderous tyrant as a compassionate person, we're actually the ones who are supposed to learn from her. We see this person who doesn't know Yahweh as their God. We see her acting better than some of God's covenant people in Genesis acted. The story of the Bible is not us good Christians or Yahweh worshippers versus those bad, evil pagans out there. No, it's of God creating all of humanity and all of humanity having the potential for good or evil. I believe it was Sky Jatani who said, the line between good and evil does not run between me and you, but the line between good and evil runs through me and through you. We all have the opportunity to behave either well or poorly to other images of God. And sometimes it's people who are outside of the church, if I can be a little anachronistic here, that behave more in line with how God wants us to treat each other. So take a lesson from Pharaoh's daughter, and perhaps also from the people in your life who don't believe the same way you do. You might have more to learn from them than you think. As we get into verse 7 here, and we see Miriam just go straight up to Pharaoh's daughter and ask her about the child, I can't stop but pause and praise her boldness. And she probably could have been killed for approaching the princess of Egypt like that. But her boldness, coupled with her ingenuity, like, I know tradition says she was about 7 years older, but that is quite the inventive 7-year-old to come up with the idea, hey, what if I suggest in secret that the kid's own mom, my own mom, takes care of him for you? Like, that is just insane. I kind of think Miriam gets a little bit of a bad rap in the biblical story. And this is another thing I would love to hear from you all on. So, drop a comment in the socials or on YouTube or what have you. And let me know, how did you hear Miriam presented whenever someone preached through Exodus? Because I always kind of got this idea that she was not a villain in the story, but an antagonist toward Moses. Especially as we get on later in the story. This will be beyond the scope of our series because it's later when they're kind of wandering in the wilderness and all. She does push back against Moses on a lot of things, and to the point that she does eventually get struck with leprosy as a punishment from God for questioning Moses. This is later in Numbers chapter 12. But what's wild is Aaron actually also questioned Moses in that same passage, and yet he's not struck with leprosy. And a little bit later, Moses himself questions God and is punished by being told he couldn't go into the promised land. So I'm not sure why we focus so much on Miriam as a negative character here. I mean, I guess I do know why. We have a very patriarchal culture in our churches. We have mostly men preaching, at least in the traditions I came from. It was entirely men preaching. And so we didn't really value female perspectives on it. So it's easy to scapegoat and just put it all on her when, honestly, I'd say Moses and Aaron had the bigger issues going on. I mean, sure, Miriam wasn't perfect, but for crying out loud, Moses is about to kill someone in a few verses. Sure, Miriam's a complex character, but she doesn't ever kill anyone like that. So I'd like to call for a reclaiming of Miriam's character. She is a hero in this story. She exhibits the same boldness before Pharaoh's daughter that Esther exhibits centuries later in front of her king. And we praise Esther for that behavior. So let's do the same for Miriam. And do you catch a little bit of the irony in her question when she asks, shall I go and call a nurse of the Hebrew women? She is asking Pharaoh's daughter, may I go? We are going to hear her brother ask that same question a lot more of Pharaoh himself in just a few chapters. And interestingly enough, in this case, it is a member of Pharaoh's household, his own daughter, who says, go. Another reason to see Miriam as a matriarch of Israel here at this point is that the word used to describe her in verse 8, Alma, It's actually the same word that causes controversies in Isaiah, the whole passage of a young woman or a virgin will conceive. If you're not 100% sure what I'm talking about there, go ahead and check out our Christmas episodes where I go into a little more detail in why that word doesn't actually mean virgin. But like I mentioned at the start of the episode, we should also be careful not to read too far in advance here. So just looking at this story and what we have before this in Genesis, there's only one other time that this word Alma has shown up, and that's Genesis 24:43, when Abraham's servant is recounting his meeting with Rebekah, who will become the wife of Isaac shortly thereafter. She was a young girl who provided new life to Abraham's line near water. They met at a well. Her story is going to get repeated before this chapter is over as well. So there's definitely some parallels going on where language is supposed to be drawing us into the rich tapestry of stories from Genesis to say, this is all connected. Read this story in light of the stories that have come before. I mean, you just have to love the irony in all of this, right? Imagine being Amram and Jochebed here, where in the morning they drop their baby off in the river thinking they're probably never going to see it again. And then before the day's out, their daughter comes running back home with the child saying, hey, the king, the Pharaoh, wants you to raise this kid and they're going to pay you for it. Remember, these were people. They felt the same emotions you and I do. I cannot even begin to imagine the roller coaster of a day that this was for Moses' family. As we move into verse 9, I'll admit I may be stretching a little bit here, but the only other time that the word for nursing has been used of a human in the biblical story so far is when Sarah had Isaac. And just as Isaac was a miraculous birth in Sarah's old age, so Moses is a miraculous rebirth. I want to pause in verse 10 for a second and draw attention to Moses' name. We've grown accustomed to saying Moses in English, but if you were reading the text in Hebrew, his name is Moshe. And many commentators will point out that Moshe in Hebrew means something close to draw out of water. But remember that this was an Egyptian who named him. She would not have likely known any Hebrew. I mean, that was the language of these slaves. So why would she know that? Well, it seems like there's a major play on words going on with Moses' name in two different languages. Because yes, Moses can be connected to a Hebrew word meaning to draw out of water, but Mose is also an Egyptian word. And you probably didn't realize this, but you already knew that. Think about some pharaohs' names. Thutmose, son of Thut. Ramses, son of Ra. Do you hear that Mose suffix in the words? So Moses' name in Hebrew is literally just son, or born, or son of. It doesn't have what's called a patronymic, a father's name. Like in Thutmose, you have son of Thut. Well, if you just have Mose, well, son of what? Exactly, because he was son of nobody. He was an abandoned child drawn out of the water. So this is such a cool instance of where the biblical authors are using two different languages to play on words with this character and suggesting things about his life that you might not realize on first glance. And with that, we are going to flash forward in Moses' life. Roughly 40 years go by in between verses 10 and 11. So let's take a quick break, and we'll come back for part 2 of chapter 2. We're about to hit a major turning point in the life of Moses. So let's pick it up with verse 11. It came to pass in those days, when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brothers, and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brothers. And he looked this way and that way. And when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian, and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said to him that did the wrong, Why did you smite your fellow? And he said, Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses feared, and said, Surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. We're going to stop there for now. It's really easy to get swept up in the narrative and just pick up right with this story. But remember, 40 years are in between verses 10 and 11. So I just want to pause for a second and give us a moment to ponder what all could have happened in those 40 years. I mean, 40 years is close to a lifetime for people in the ancient world sometimes. Imagine the life he would have lived. Imagine the friendships he would have formed with Egyptian royalty in that time. I mean, he likely would have been in line to potentially become a pharaoh himself, or at least pretty high up in the court. And I can't help but think that if he was basically Pharaoh's grandson in a way, he probably would not have gone those 40 years unmarried. It's quite likely that Moses would have had a family in the Egyptian palace. Now, we're never told this in the biblical text. We're not told if he had a wife or multiple wives or multiple children, but it seems really likely to me that he would have. So that means that he's leaving all of this behind when he has to leave, and apparently never connects with them again, at least from the perspective of the biblical authors. It really makes you question what made him decide to go out and intervene that day. And he had so much to lose. What changed in him that he connected himself with these Hebrew people? We don't have anything in the narrative that says when or even if he found out that he himself was a Hebrew. Now, the narrator comes in and says that he went out to his brethren, but at first we're almost meant to question, I think, whether that means the Egyptian brethren or the Hebrew brethren, because there's nothing to indicate that he knew he himself was a Hebrew. Now, at the end of verse 11, it says that he saw an Egyptian smiting a Hebrew, one of his brothers. Or more literally, from his brothers, from his family, from his clan, from his tribesmen. So that seems to indicate a knowledge of his Hebrew lineage, but is that the author's knowledge of that? Or is that Moses' knowledge of that? We're not clued in. And if he did know that he was a Hebrew, whether that was something he found out the day before, or the year before, or 10 years before, why did he choose to intervene now? I mean, if he had known this for a while, surely he would have seen the Hebrews being mistreated before that particular day. Unfortunately, it's all speculation. But I kind of like to think of it as if he had just recently, like maybe the day before, found out somehow, maybe from his mom or overhearing a conversation he wasn't supposed to, that he himself was a Hebrew. And so he goes out with this newfound knowledge to look upon these people and see what that means for him, to process what this new information means for his future. And it would be like, I don't know, if you found out that you were adopted, and then you go to see your biological family, and as soon as you drive up to the house, you see someone beating up your biological parents. Like, how would that make you feel? But it does kind of make you question whether Moses here saved his family member, his tribesman, or whether he killed his tribesmen. The answer is kind of both. Verse 12 gives us more foreshadowing of what's going to happen for Israel. Because just as when Israel leaves Egypt, the waters are going to part on the one hand and on the other, and then they will pass through on dry ground. So now Moses looks to the left and looks to the right and then moves forward. I realize I'm asking for a lot of interaction from you all here in this episode, but I really do enjoy hearing from you and learning about the different ways that the biblical text has been taught to our listeners. I would love to find out, what were you taught, if anything at all, about the significance of Moses looking around before he kills the Egyptian? I know with how I was raised, I had heard that he was looking around to make sure no one would snitch on him, right? Like, there's no one around, no one to witness this. Okay, now I'm going to murder this guy. But very similar language is used in Isaiah 59:16. Let me read that for you real fast. He, that is God, saw there was no man, and wondered that there was no intercessor. Therefore his arm brought salvation to him, and his righteousness sustained him. So in that particular instance, God is looking around for somebody to step in and do something, and yet he finds no one. So this might be a little controversial, but I think we can use the meaning in that passage to inform our reading of this one. And if that's the case, Moses wasn't looking around to make sure no one was going to witness his crime. he might have actually been looking around for someone else to step in and help. Perhaps he was looking for an Egyptian soldier who could outrank this man and tell him to stop. Or, I mean, he himself had that power, possibly. I mean, we don't know what Moses' position in the royal court would have been or what power came with that. Maybe he was looking around for another Hebrew to see if he could have help in this fight if he needed it. Like, we don't know. But I think it lends to the realization that when we feel like we're out of options, we make bad choices. And this happens a lot where people just get stuck in a really bad situation and they're looking around for help. They are crying out for help. They're trying to see if anyone around will make a difference. But when you feel like you're out of options, you make mistakes. And that's exactly what Moses is about to do. He was trying to be a deliverer, like Abel was supposed to be, but he becomes a manslayer, like Cain was. And if I can put on my therapist hat for a second here, I think if we dig into the psychology of this verse, there is something really powerful in the fact that the text reads that he first saw two men. He sees the Egyptian and the Hebrew. But in verse 12, when he looks this way and that way, it says that he saw there was no man. And you might notice there was is in italics. So it's literally when he saw no man. In his attempt to save the Hebrew slave, he sucked the humanity out of both of them. In his anger, he didn't see the Egyptian as human. That's what tribalism does to us. We miss the humanity in the other person. I realize that's spiritualizing the text a bit, but I think it's very appropriate for the time in which we live, where tribalism seems to be growing ever stronger in America and particularly in American Christianity. We need to be careful that when we look around, we see the humans that are there, and not just somebody that we can strip the humanity from and treat like an enemy. And the end of verse 12 really fascinates me, because it says that he buried him in the sand. And that word sand is almost always used in the Tanakh to describe the descendants of Abraham as being more in number than the sand of the sea. So the word that was most often used of how Israel was to be a blessing is used only here in the Bible in a negative sense, as Moses actually brings a curse upon the land rather than a blessing. At the risk of spiritualizing a little bit again here, I have to let the therapist in me come out and draw attention to the fact that quick answers never solve the problem. And more often than not, the problem is not actually something outside of us. Going back to that Sky Jathani quote, the line between good and evil is not between you and me, but rather runs through me and through you. See, more often than not, our conflicts are just as much internal as they are external. The things we are most annoyed by with other people are actually often the blind spots we have in our own lives with ourselves. We like to think if we could just remove stupid people from our lives, things would be so much better. But when you remove everyone else, you're left with no one but yourself. And that forces you to come to grips with the fact that the fight is actually in yourself. Who do you side with when the enemy is you? Moses saw the enemy as being someone else, as being an external problem. And yet when he removed it, he is left with just as big, if not a bigger problem. And that is the darkness inside himself that has now come out. He saw that darkness in another and was quick to judge it. But in so doing, he actually went a step further. See, what the Egyptian was doing was just beating the Hebrew. Now, that's certainly not a good thing, but it's not quite as bad as killing someone. And that's what Moses did. To right a wrong, he committed an even worse wrong. And that's what we so often do with other people. We see the speck in their eye, to use Jesus' language. We see the brokenness in their life. And we attack that. We make fun of that. We use that to make ourselves feel better about ourselves. All the while having the very same blind spots in our own lives. It's most often the things that annoy you most about other people that are actually your own flaws as well. And sometimes that's why they annoy us so much, because deep down, subconsciously, we realize that's a part of ourselves that is still broken, that we haven't brought healing to. But it's hard to step into that and try to heal that broken side of us. It's easier to just point out the brokenness in others. And that all leads me to question, what could Moses have done differently here? I mean, this is a bad situation he walked into. And again, we don't actually know what his position or power would have been. So would he have even just had the authority to step in and say, hey, stop that? Would that have gotten him ratted out to Pharaoh or to some higher up? That could have gotten him in trouble for even just stopping the Egyptian from beating the Hebrew. It was not a good situation. So I don't want to be too hard on him here, but by the same token, quick answers never solve the problem. And if it seems like it's the only possible option, well, that probably just means that you actually need to step away and reconsider what your options are. And given the situation Moses walked into, I'll acknowledge walking away and reconsidering his options would not have done much good either there. So it just kind of leaves you in this no-win situation. And what would he do? I'd love to hear from y'all. What do you think Moses should have done here? Did he do the right thing? The biblical authors don't actually weigh in on the morality of his decision. Was he right to kill the Egyptian to save the Hebrew? Should he just have tried to stop it? What if that would have gotten him in just as much trouble? Would that have been the right thing to do? Could he have done more good if he just stayed within the court of Pharaoh and tried to find some way to bring reform there and maybe free the slaves from within? There are just so many different ways you can look at this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Alter insightfully observes that the first dialogue assigned to a character in the biblical narrative typically defines the character. Moses' first speech is a reproof to a fellow Hebrew in an attempt to impose a standard of justice. Come on, that's his role in the rest of the biblical story, right? He reproves his fellow people and tries to impose justice on them. Like that, it's so cool how the biblical authors put that in as his first words, and it's going to be what defines the rest of his life. When he comes out in verse 14 the next day, and he sees two Hebrews fighting with each other, he tries to stop them, and the one asks him, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us?" That word prince is the same word translated captain in Genesis 37 to 41 to describe Potiphar, an Egyptian general over soldiers and prisoners. This question then is rather ironic, since Moses does indeed become both a general and a judge over Israel later in the book. And here's where we start getting some major parallels to Jacob's story from Genesis. Beginning with the word surely that Moses says. Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." It's the Hebrew word akain. It's not that common in the Bible, and the only other time it's been used in the story so far is Genesis 28:16, when Jacob wakes up from his dream after leaving his father's house, running away from Esau, and he says, "Surely Yahweh is in this place." So I think there's a little bit of a contrast going on here, where Jacob says, "Surely Yahweh is in this place," and Moses in fear says, "Surely this thing is known." I realize with just that information, that might seem like a little bit of a stretch. But hold on, because the parallels to Jacob's story are going to start coming rapid fire in these next few verses here, to the point that I think anything that is even just a possible connection to Jacob's story is probably intentional on the part of the author. The very next verse says that Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh. And that fled word is the same word used when Jacob fled from Esau and when Hagar fled from Sarai earlier in the Genesis story. And the text tells us that he went to Midian. Now, we haven't seen much of Midian at this point in the story. Genesis 25:2 indicates that perhaps the Midianites descended from Abraham as well. It's not 100% certain that the Midian mentioned there would be the father or the progenitor of the Midianite tribe, but that seems to be the implication. They're also listed as some of the slavers who took Joseph to Egypt in Genesis 37. Now, that's a whole other wild thing, because there's two different groups of people that are said to take Joseph into slavery in Egypt there. That's another matter for another day. We're not getting into Genesis 37 right now. But that's all we really know of the Midianites up until this point. And as Moses goes to Midian, he's about 40 years old here, remember. So once again, I just want to draw your attention to all the things that he would have left behind. There's no indication that he ran back to Pharaoh's palace to try to gather some stuff. It sounds like he just left, just vanished off the map. That is yet another way that his story foreshadows Israel as they will one day leave Egypt in haste as well. Verse 15 ended with Moses sitting at a well. Wells are very significant in Scripture. I don't think we've talked about this yet in the podcast because they didn't really show up in Genesis 1 through 11 or really in any of the other episodes we've done. But wells are water in a place seemingly without water. You know, they're not where you have a pond or a lake or anything like that. You have to dig for it. And in a desert climate like that, a place where there is water, where there shouldn't be water, is a very restful place. They are signals of Eden oases. So whenever you see a well in the biblical story, it's basically Eden imagery. It's trying to say this is a place of peace, a place of rest, a place of God's blessing in a desert wilderness that you would not expect. I realize we did not cover this in our Genesis series, so major gold star to anyone that picks this out here. But when was the last time in the biblical story that an Israelite sat down by a well? I'll give you a second. Ready? All right. It was Jacob, right? I told you there were going to be more parallels to Jacob. The story when Jacob runs away from Esau, he goes to the region of his extended family, and he pauses at this well where he's going to meet his future bride. And even that story maps onto the story of how Jacob's father, Isaac, met his bride when his father, Abraham, sent out a servant to go find the bride, and he finds her at a well. So here we are, Exodus 2, Moses leaves Egypt, he sits down at a well. What should we be expecting? Well, no pun intended, let's find out. Let's read the rest of the chapter, beginning in verse 16. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. Here we go. And they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flocks. And when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How come you're back so soon today?" And they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock." And he said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Call him, that he can come eat bread with us." And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses Zipporah, his daughter.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
And she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a strange land." And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage. And they cried, and their cry came up to God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob. And God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. Okay, so verse 16, we are introduced to this priest of Midian. And I don't want to read ahead too far here. Remember, we're trying to read this like this is our first time ever seeing the story. He is not yet said to be a believer in Yahweh. I think there are clues that he might be, like the fact that he has 7 daughters. I mean, come on, 7, really? And the well incident, when you compare it to Jacob's, along with his being introduced as Reuel. Notice that El suffix there. El is the Hebrew word for God. Furthermore, Reuel is actually a name from the line of Esau. Now, it's not the same person because too much time had passed between them, but it could suggest that maybe Reuel was from the line of Esau. So he would have been a very, very, very distant cousin for Moses. I think that suggests that at very least he was familiar with Yahweh. And this is going to go a little beyond the scope of our series, but Exodus 18:11, this character, Reuel, shows up again, and he says to Moses, "Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods." So that suggests that at this point, he didn't think that. Now, maybe he was familiar with Yahweh, but just saw him as one amongst the pantheon of gods. But we don't really know for sure what his relationship is with Yahweh. We're just told that he is a priest in Midian. We have to be careful not to think that the Israelites were the only people ever to know of the god El or Yahweh. Variations of both names show up in other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So it is entirely possible that even though this man was not of the line of Jacob, he could very well have been a Yahweh worshiper, or at least familiar with the traditions around Yahweh. I think a lot of us modern Christians reading this would normally be skeptical of a priest from a foreign nation in a biblical story. We wouldn't expect him to be on the same side or worshiping the God of Abraham. But this guy's going to surprise us in a lot of ways. And I think the first clue that he's more than you might think is that he has 7 daughters. 7 links us right back to creation, right? The text never says that he didn't have any sons or maybe even had more daughters, but it focuses in on these 7 in particular to make a theological point that this was someone in sync with Yahweh's mission. And much like with the midwives who helped out the Hebrew women, Pharaoh's daughter, the good guys are not just the covenant family. We have to be so careful when we read the biblical text not to assume that the good guys are always the Israelites and the bad guys are everyone else. That's not how the Bible works. The biblical vision is that humanity, all humans, can be either good or bad, and that God wants to bring us all together. Now, he's working to do that through a particular covenant family at this point, but that doesn't mean that everyone else is rejected or that no one else could be saved or believed in God or any of that stuff. Well, there were Yahweh-fearers, there were good people all throughout the world at this point. He's just working through this one particular family for greater ends. But that doesn't mean that any individual at any other place in the world couldn't be a Yahweh worshiper or even a good person. I would challenge you, as you start to read the Bible now moving forward, look for all the ways that people from outside the line of Israel, from outside the chosen seed, often end up behaving better than the people within the chosen line. And let that influence the way you see other people who don't believe exactly like you do. Jumping back for a second to Jacob's story and the hyperlinks here, the word in verse 16 that the King James has as troughs, they filled their troughs with water to water their father's flock, that's a very rare word that's only used 2 other times in Scripture. And they're both in Genesis 30 when Jacob cheated his father-in-law out of a large portion of his herd. Now in that passage, the King James translates it as gutters, but it's the same word. And that is a very weird passage. Honestly, I think one of the strangest in the Bible. And I wish we had time to go into that today. That'll have to be its own episode at some other point. But if you're interested in what I'm talking about, go check out Genesis 30 sometime and try to make sense of what's going on there. It's wild what Jacob does to specifically breed certain animals in order to cheat his father-in-law out of his flocks and herds. So we have a link now, again, between Jacob's story and Moses' story. And it forces us to ask the question, is Moses going to deceive this new family and scheme to make life work in his favor like his ancestor Jacob? Or will he trust Yahweh to provide? And I can't help but see a little bit of a fourth wall break on the part of the narrator here, asking us the same question. Which will you choose? Now in verse 18, Moses' future father-in-law, this priest of Midian, is named Ruel. All the remaining times he pops up in the story, though, he's called Jethro. I mean, as soon as Exodus chapter 3, so like literally 1 chapter later, he's called Jethro. He's never called Ruel again. And for some reason, the King James and Young's literal translation are the only 2 English translations I could find that also translate his name Raguel, with a G, R-A-G-U-E-L. And they only do that in Numbers 10:29. Now, Raguel, that comes from Latin, so I understand where they got it from. It was the Latin spelling of Ruel's name, found in the Vulgate from around the late 300s CE. About 1,000 years later, Wycliffe kept it in as Raguel in Numbers 10:29 only when he translated the Vulgate into English. And for some reason, the King James, 300 years later, decided to keep it there only as well. I think a minute ago I said that he is only called Ruel here in this passage. I sort of misspoke. He is only called Ruel here in this part of Exodus. He is also called Ruel in Numbers 10:29. Every other time he's called Jethro. So here this one time in Exodus 2 and once in Numbers 10:29, he's called Ruel. And if you were reading in the Latin Vulgate, both of those cases, this one here in Exodus 2 and the Numbers 10:29 one, would say Raguel. That was just the Latin translation, so that's fine. But for whatever reason, Wycliffe and then the King James and then Young's literal all kept Raguel just in Numbers 10:29 while saying Ruel here. I'm really not sure why they did that. It really flares up my OCD, but I have to lay that aside because we're about to get even more complicated. Yay! Don't you all love when I do that? This is about to get way funkier, all right? So we have him called Ruel here in this passage and also in Numbers 10:29. Setting aside the weird English translation choice for the moment in the Numbers passage. In Exodus 3, 4, and 18, he's called Jethro. But then, if you take a closer look at Numbers 10:29, It reads that Hobab was Moses' brother-in-law, a son of Ruel slash Jethro. Okay, that's fine. That doesn't really change anything. Judges 4:11, however, says that Hobab was Reuel or Jethro, or whichever one he is, Moses' father-in-law. Let me read it for you. Judges 4:11. Now Heber the Kenite, which was of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. What? So now we have three different names for this guy, plus an extra English slash Latin name. So what's going on here? Well, some have suggested that Jethro may not have been a name, but rather an honorific title, kind of like Pharaoh, or president in English. Then there's some extremely nerdy Hebrew grammar commentary that can get thrown in there that some scholars use to suggest that Hobab and Ruel were actually the same person, just using different names. Perhaps one was a personal name while the other was for official clan use. It is fascinating to note that only a couple people in the Hebrew Bible have the name Ruel. One of them was a son of Esau. I think I mentioned that earlier. So perhaps the text is here introducing us to Jethro Hobab. Jethro being his title, Hobab being his actual name. But they use his personal family name of Ruel first in order to clue us into the fact that he was familiar with the God of Abraham, maybe by being somehow connected through the line of Esau, who was a grandson of Abraham. So maybe he was even named after his potential great grandfather, or whatever he would have been. We can't know for sure, and trust me, this rabbit hole will make your head hurt more than you can possibly imagine, but it is a legitimate theory. Another rabbit hole about this guy that really just kind of bugs me is if he knew that the shepherds were bothering his daughters, why didn't he do something about it? And when they come back home after Moses has helped them, he says, "What are you doing back so early?" As if he knew that they had trouble every time they went for water. Like, why didn't he go with them, or send someone with them, or go to a different well, or any of these things? I don't know. And it kind of bugs me, but the text doesn't seem to be interested in going down that rabbit hole. I do find it intriguing that the daughters say he was an Egyptian man. They said, "An Egyptian man delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds." So apparently he looked Egyptian. And they don't realize it, but what they said is almost a prophetic foreshadowing of what's to come. Because they said, "This Egyptian man delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds." Well, he's actually a Hebrew man who is going to deliver these shepherds, that's what the Hebrews were known as to the Egyptians, out of the hand of the Egyptians. So it's kind of a flip-flop, unintentional prophecy. Now, the word used here of his drawing water is different from Mashah, which is used when he is drawn out of the water, connected to Moshe. But I think we are supposed to see a little bit of a connection there, or at least a little bit of the notes of the melody of the water theme, the leitmotif, if you will, of water throughout his story here. So, different word, but I think the connection is still there. I'm also intrigued by how, even though the daughter said he is an Egyptian man, Ruel just says, "a man." Where did you leave the man? I don't want to bring in modern concepts of race to this and say, oh, Ruel didn't see color. He didn't see that he was Egyptian. I'm not sure what to make of that, if anything. But it is intriguing to me that the daughters recognize him as being Egyptian and Ruel doesn't. I'm not sure what to make of that, if anything. And I joked that verse 21 really escalated the story quickly. But in all reality, we don't know how much time that took. Just like 40 years transpire between verses 10 and 11, and we're not told that, we're also not told how much time passes here. But we do find out later that Moses spent another 40 years there in Midian. We don't know where in those 40 years he got married to Zipporah. It could have been 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, we don't know. But the story has to move forward. Exodus is not a biography of Moses, so some of these details we would love to have, well, they're just not relevant to the story of how God is going to free his people in order to restore his relationship with humanity. So it's fun to speculate, but it's not what the authors are focused on. There is a detail here that you're likely to miss if you're not reading in Hebrew, and that's that Zipporah's name is actually really similar to the Hebrew name for Shiphrah, one of the two midwives from the previous chapter. In fact, if you were reading in the Greek Septuagint, their names are identical. And when Moses has his first son with her, Gershom, That is the same root from a few verses before when the shepherds drove the women away. That's Gerash. This is Gershom. So same root. And it's almost like Moses named his son after the first time that he met Zipporah. This is the story of how I met your mother, kids, right? It's in your very name. And the root even gets used a few more times in the Exodus story, so hyperlinking us back to this event. It does beg the question, though, when he says, because I am a stranger in a strange land, does he mean that he was a foreigner in Midian or in the world as a whole? Because at this point, he doesn't belong to any tribe. He lost his Hebrew identity over 40 years earlier, and he just lost his Egyptian identity. So he truly is a stranger in a strange land. And as the story shifts back to Egypt in verse 23, we read that in the process of time, the king of Egypt died. This is a really important point that a lot of people seem to miss. The Pharaoh that killed the babies in the first two chapters is not the same Pharaoh of the Exodus. So the Pharaoh that is there when Moses is born is a different Pharaoh from the one who experiences the plagues. And again, we don't know who either of these pharaohs are, so it's all conjecture. But if it stayed within the same dynasty, and this new pharaoh was the son of the old pharaoh, that would basically make him Moses' uncle. And depending on the age gap, they could have maybe even been raised almost as brothers. This is what I like about some of the cinematic versions of the Exodus story, is when you get to see the relationship that Moses and the Pharaoh of the Exodus may have had together growing up, and how much pathos that brings into the narrative of his conflict with the Pharaoh. But before we get there, we first see God hearing the cry of his oppressed people. I love the ambiguity of this text here, because that word for cry, it could mean to cry out for help, like to scream help, or it could just mean to cry. And so there's nothing here to indicate that the Israelites were specifically praying to God to save them. I'm sure some were, but we could also just read this text as they were crying in pain, agonizing over the way that they had been oppressed. And yet God still intervened without a specific request. There is no recorded prayer for deliverance here. God just hears their cry and says, oh, somebody's in pain. I need to step in. It's also very reminiscent of Genesis 4, where the blood of Abel cries out to God from the ground. As the Israelites are working the ground and their blood is falling into the ground as the Egyptian taskmasters beat them, God hears that. Don't let the wording of verse 24 in English throw you when it says that God remembered his covenant. God didn't forget about his people during their time in Egypt. The word translated remember actually literally means to name, mention, proclaim, or sometimes even to take to court. And I realize we can't just lump all those definitions together and say this is what the word means. But I think what the verse is actually trying to get at is that God surveyed the situation and decided it was time to act. It's kind of like Thanos during the end credits scene from Age of Ultron, right? He saw the events were right for him to act, and he gets up off his throne and says,
Fine. I'll do it myself.
God gave Pharaoh time to change his ways, and will give him even more chances in the next several chapters, but he's now setting in motion a plan that will change the course of human history. Verse 25 ends with a really strange phrasing, particularly, again, if you notice italics, because it says God had respect unto them, to the children of Israel. But them is in italics. So the verse would literally just end, God had respect unto. And that word translated respect literally just means to know. He remembered them. He took notice in respect to them. Similar to the statement from the previous verse, God has said that enough is enough and it's time to act. We're being set up for all that is going to happen in the next several chapters. So let me close out here with a quote from Alter. Until this point, God has not been evident in the story. And that's true, he hasn't really been mentioned at all. Now, he is the subject of a string of significant verbs. Hear, remember, which in the Hebrew has the strong force of take to heart, see, and know. The last of these terms marks the end of the narrative segment with a certain mystifying note, sufficiently mystifying that the ancient Greek translators sought to quote-unquote correct it because it has no object. God knew. But what did he know? Presumably the suffering of the Israelites, the cruel oppression of history in which they are now implicated, the obligations of the covenant with the patriarchs, and the plan he must undertake to liberate the enslaved people. And so the objectless verb prepares us for the divine address from the burning bush and the beginning of Moses' mission. End quote. Wow, what a story, right? I hope that even just 2 chapters in, you're starting to see why I'm so enthusiastic about this text. And next week just gets even better because God steps in and Moses becomes the reluctant hero who starts to debate with God. It's a fascinating passage. I can't wait to get into that. Now, before too long, I want to do a question and response episode here. So probably a few more weeks out for that, but start thinking of some questions that you might have about something we've covered or something that we will cover before Exodus 15. You can always send them in by email, cconn@thebibleuncut.com. We have a contact us form on the homepage of the website. We have a Discord up and running now. And of course, you can always comment on our social media posts and our YouTube videos. We love hearing from you. Next time, I'll see you at the burning bush. But until then, stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.